Yeah.
So we'll keep our conversation going on. It's very interesting to hear from you about Ruby as a language.
Yeah.
Um, in my experience, I have also found that learning Ruby is pretty easy, especially for
Yeah.
testing purposes. It's rightly said. Ruby says that you can learn Ruby in 20 minutes.
Yeah. I mean,
Using
that's one of the
learning
things.
Ruby is pretty
Yeah.
easy, especially for testing purposes. It's right. Yeah.
Oh.
So you can hear me, right, Luke?
Yeah.
I was just getting my echo back. So you can hear me, right? Okay, cool. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the Selenium Community Live event. We have episode 6, and we have with us Luke Hill, who has been a very old contributor and maintainer of Selenium project. Welcome, Luke. This is your first podcast, as you
Yes.
have
Thank you
said,
very much,
and
Pallavi. Thank you.
it's an honor to have you with us. Luke works as a lead QA at Dexter's Estate, and he is basically an open source enthusiast. He owns a Site Prism project, which is built over Capybara. And now, not taking much of your time, I would basically leave the stage to Luke, and we will be having question and answers at the end of the session. But feel free to post your questions for Luke as he takes us along this journey on the topic of the maintainer's perspective on various open source project where Luke works on. So thank you very much, Luke. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Pallavi. Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me today onto this podcast. So, first of all, it's always easy to start with a little introduction and go through a few of the topics that I'd like to cover today. So, for me, my name's Luke. Predominantly, I've got a background actually in maths and education, and then I pivoted in my mid-20s into sort of technology. Sort of fell in love with being a QA, trying to sort of bend systems, find vulnerabilities in systems. I love doing that, problem solving. Um, so the talk today is on about the maintainer's perspective. So to start with, how did I become involved specifically with open source technologies? So using tools like Selenium, which I did from a very early point in my career, I actually started with what was the old legacy recorder on Firefox. But it was always a way in which you could do web automation very easily. So with me, the first company I joined where I was doing what was called WebDriver, so Selenium WebDriver in version 2, was using Ruby. So for me, that's what I learned, and that's what I was a big sort of advocate of. And very quickly, I realized that you could do the testing with Selenium Ruby really easily. And I joined a company where actually a lot of the architecture was already done. So we used Cucumber and Capybara and Site Prism as mentioned. So why was it important for me to use Ruby then, and the introduction of what I've done in terms of my open source maintenance? I kind of fell into it a little bit by mistake, but in essence, it was what the company was using for their development stack. I think this is something that a lot of people say, that, oh, you need to have the development stack and the testing stack in the same language. I think actually more often than not, you don't need to do that, especially in today's day and age with things like containerization. So for me, that is sort of my introduction, if you like, into how I fell into testing. Was a job where I was needing to do some automation with Selenium and Ruby. And we were automating a booking application for a holiday company. And so we were automating the flows where you would go through and book the various holidays. The stuff I would like to talk about today, the easy one to talk about is obviously history. That's the easy one to explain about the various projects I'm involved with, how they've started and how they've moved forward. But as the podcast suggests, I'd like to talk a little bit about the maintainer's challenge. So what do I mean by that? I mean how you maintain a piece of open source software that has a community that requires support. It also has requirements and needs, as well as things like generic maintenance and bug fixing. And of course, with it being open source, you need to ensure that you're still able to work on this in your free time as a hobby project, if you like, or something. I'm going to spend a little bit of time after that looking at a bit of the technical deep dive. I'm not going to go into too much detail, and this technical deep dive will look at Site Prism, because that's the framework essentially that I maintain, and it's my framework for a page object model gem. And obviously I'll cover a little bit about what that means in the technical deep dive. And then to finish on sort of a nice to have, I think it's always important that we consider not just the past, but the future. Obviously the present I'll be talking about in my day-to-day working career, but I think the future is really important, because how is testing going to look in 10 years, especially given that I've worked for 11 years as a QA. So what trends and what things do I think will be coming to the fore, if you like? So let's start with the history then. Let's start with the past. So we've got Selenium and Ruby. So Selenium, as we know, it has 5 major flavors: C#, Java, Ruby, Python, and in JavaScript. What's really important is when Selenium was being built, a lot of the people who did a lot of the early architecture made a lot of good decisions, especially with the migration from the 2 products, Selenium and WebDriver, into the 1, Selenium WebDriver. And so the earliest maintainers of the Ruby package for Selenium WebDriver, I think, made a lot of good decisions, specifically around making it a fairly rudimentary surface, whereby you would call your commands and then have all of the API layer do all of the talking to the driver. Obviously, in the old days, we didn't have a single common sort of W3C conformant endpoint, so which by all of the flavors of Selenium and all of the drivers speak a common language. That sort of layer, if you like, was very good, but what it meant was that the browser was doing a lot of low-level stuff. And again, fundamentally, we have to remember with Selenium that its purpose is as a browser automation tool. So by that, it automates the browsers. And a lot of people obviously want to be testers or QAs, and they want to validate, does the website behave as expected with web-based automation? And so what you found very early on, especially in a lot of the languages, but Ruby in particular, was there was these abstraction libraries that would sort of sit on top of or wrap Selenium. And I'm a big advocate of this, because it enables you to take something that's good, that does a really good job, Selenium, and tweak it to what you would need it to do, which is testing or QA. And so I'm not going to go through all of the various sort of functionalities or, different levels of abstraction that you can do. But fundamentally in Selenium Ruby, we were very lucky early on in that there was only 2 major abstraction libraries. You've got Water, which was built by a couple of the maintainers who were maintaining Selenium Ruby, who recognized we've got this generic tool, we want a testing-based tool. There was also another one called Capybara. And Capybara, as my talk sort of hints at, is the tool that my framework, SitePrism, wraps. So SitePrism is sort of like a double wrapper, if you like. That then, with the evolution of Capybara, enabled testing to become so much easier. And with tools like Cucumber as well, Cucumber being built predominantly in Ruby to start with, it just all fitted very nicely together. So when you set up this stack, it was always get Selenium, get Capybara, get Cucumber, and work through it. And so, especially in those early days, historically, the Ruby community had a very sort of productive time in terms of these initial tools being created and rapidly evolving. SitePrism sort of came a little bit later than that, sort of, I would say, mid to late noughties. And the key thing with SitePrism was pages getting more complex. So again, we're moving away from the very simple pages to more complex pages. We're having, account pages. We're having websites that you log into, things like Facebook, for instance. But the other thing to bear in mind with something like SitePrism is it's purely an abstraction library. It's designed to give everything a nice, neat place to live, so that when you're then writing this extensible testing code, you can write single pages that contain the code for a single page. If you like, think of it as a bit like everything has a place and everything is in its place. And that's the key thing with SitePrism. As SitePrism evolved in sort of the mid to late teens and going forward through now to 2020, I've obviously got involved, do a lot of the development with SitePrism. But I would say in recent times, the history of SitePrism has been more about new features and making things sort of cleaner and leaner, because a lot of the heavy lifting has actually already been built with SitePrism. So it's in a situation where the interface about how you use SitePrism, by and large, hasn't changed in the last 7, 8, 9 years, which means as a maintainer, it's very easy to sort of develop new features because it's going to conform to that existing structure. So how do these tools fit together? So SitePrism is very strongly coupled to Capybara. So in other words, you cannot use SitePrism unless you use Capybara. And Capybara is obviously strongly coupled to Selenium. Now, Capybara does work with other web-based automation libraries. You can use things off the shelf like Rack, but it helps if you're using Selenium. That is to say, you don't have to use Selenium, but it makes things easier. When you are using Capybara and you're driving Selenium or whatever web automation library you wish to use, the way in which SitePrism sits on top is purely through the creation of these page classes. Now, what SitePrism also evangelizes is the concept of sections, which is parts of a page, and it also leans on all of the standard things that Ruby and other programming languages will have in their variants, such as classes, methods, modules or helpers, as well as the generic data types, strings, symbols, hashes, arrays. So in that vein, SitePrism is no different to any other library. It just adds that page object layer. So if you advocate for the page object model, SitePrism is the place to be if you're using Selenium with Ruby wrapped with Capybara. Seeing that tool fit, though, then pushes you down another avenue, which is how do you want to define these pages? So more often than not, you want to define them with single elements. So you want to say, here is a text box, here is a button. What is very helpful in Ruby, and what a lot of Ruby libraries are quite keen on, is using declarative code or DSL code. So instead of defining methods, you simply write a piece of text that gets procedurally ran. So what happens with SitePrism that's maybe a little bit different to other libraries is you don't define your elements. What you do is you define instructions, and those instructions will then build those elements. And there's a very subtle reason why. When you build these elements, SitePrism will then try and build associate methods around it. And when I go to the technical deep dive, you'll see this in a little bit more detail. So what SitePrism is looking to do is to make your life as easy as possible, if you're using the page object model, to define a very small surface layer of these buttons and these fields, and SitePrism will take care of everything else. Furthermore, if you're using things such as sections and page composition or inheritance, SitePrism will also scope those. So when you're using SitePrism and you're using locators, it will only locate inside the area that you're currently scoped to. So if you're inside a section, it will only look inside that section for whatever element you've asked for. If you're trying to find something outside that section, it won't find it, which is really useful because it shows you where things are enclosed. Given that's how the tools fit together and a little bit of the history, let's go forward to maybe the next element of this talk, which is about the maintainer's challenge and a bit more about me, if you like. So maintaining these libraries, specifically I've spoken about SitePrism, but let's also not forget Selenium and Cucumber. It's hard because you have a very large draw from the community. So Selenium, for instance, you've got 5 different languages for official versions of Selenium. Cucumber, in the various guises, has got anywhere from 3 to over 10 different languages. And each of those will have common components and bespoke components. So the sheer volume or complexity of the amount of code that is being maintained can get very high. And what you'll tend to find with open source is as maintainers will support something, they'll support the thing they like or that they are using. And so what happens is you tend to always need that demand for maintainers. Selenium as a community, I think, has been very lucky in that regard, that the maintainers that they have had, and I'm not going to list them all because there's too many to name, have been really good craftsmen and craftswomen and architects about how to structure things correctly. The leadership team has been amazing. And I think overall the structure from top to bottom has been really, really good. I mean, even looking at something like today where we've got, a community-led effort from Pallavi driving this Selenium Live podcast, I think that's something that should be really praised and cherished. And sometimes as a maintainer, it can be a thankless task, maintaining these libraries because you want to, knowing that so many people rely on them. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, you're not able to fix everything because you haven't got the time, or there's something that you haven't got the expertise in to look at. So I think open source communities, and I think they do this very well in a lot of instances, have got that duty of care to try and bring on those new maintainers and be as accessible and as open and as welcoming as possible. But I think at the same time, a lot of the community needs to understand that maintaining these libraries can be quite hard. And so when things don't always work first time, try and just take a step back and imagine that. One of the biggest things to consider is the concept of backwards compatibility. Things like semantic versioning is really important. Obviously, with Selenium, it doesn't quite follow standard semantic versioning, but with libraries like Cucumber and SitePrism, we do try to adhere to it as much as possible, so that when we either deliberately or accidentally break things, we do so in a way in which people can track through a major version update or a bug fix. And that's really important, because what you'll realize with these libraries, whether it's Selenium or Cucumber or SitePrism, is the amount of companies using this span pretty much every continent, bar maybe Antarctica. They span a wide variety of industries. Cucumber, for instance, has been used, across government in the UK, across technical teams in America, both in fintech and startups. A lot of big companies in America use Ruby for their building frameworks for things like GitHub, the early advocates of Twitter. So these tools, such as Selenium and Cucumber, will be used in such a wide array of circumstances and such a wide use case, such that you will find that the standard use case can vary person to person. And that backwards compatibility is important, because you do want to build backwards compatibility into a piece of software, but you also want to be able to start fresh, start anew. I think that's really important when you consider something like SitePrism, because SitePrism is obviously a much smaller community and framework compared to, say, Cucumber or Selenium, but we have had to rebuild SitePrism a couple of times, or at least rebuild a lot of the internals. And being able to do that, knowing that the major version update is there, is really refreshing, because if you document it well and explain what you're doing and why you're doing it, I think the support will be predominantly good. And I speak from experience. When I've done major version updates, which I've done 3 in the last 7 years, they've been well received, and people have understood that, okay, this thing needs to change, or this thing needs to improve. I think with something like Selenium, it's much harder because the volume is so much higher. Millions of people use Selenium worldwide, so doing major version updates is so hard. And so I think that the versioning system with Selenium is obviously prone to a little bit of trickery, shall we say, where you find that sometimes there has been a version update that's broke a lot of things. But I think with Selenium, where maybe they excel is that community is so active and so well versed across all languages and all abilities that they're able to really sort of hammer down and find those issues when they occur, or explain why things need to improve. And so I'm very impressed with the way in which a lot of the Selenium stuff is handled. The community expectation, though, I think is important, because especially in recent times when I've been maintaining SitePrism, some of the things I've been building have been more feature-based or more like offshoots. And so it's always nice when you get into one of these new little offshoots, because you're building something that is directly for the community. So one offshoot that I built for SitePrism a couple of years ago was something called the All There gem. And very simply, all it was looking to do was just recurse through page objects. So instead of testing a page object, then testing the section, then testing an element inside that section, I wanted to, inside a page object, just test everything that flowed through it. That became a problem, though, if you had lots of sections, and sometimes those sections might even be enumerable. So you might have a series of repeatable sections. So it could be a flight record, or it could be a search result. And you wanted to check each of those had all of the elements, or each of those conformed to certain rules. Doing that development, though, does give a sense of pride, because when you build that thing from start to finish, you can go, well, I needed to build this for this community expectation, and I did that. And I've done that in various other guises. When I was working at Citizens Advice, I built some little helper frameworks for testing that will give little helper methods that are very useful in Ruby for testing. such as, extensions to common libraries like the arrays and strings that give you new little helpers that I was using more and more, and I found that open sourcing them made perfect sense. That little last bit that I mentioned there about that open sourcing of, extensions to arrays or strings whilst I was working at a previous job, I think that's important because that sort of touches on the next point I wanted to hint at, which was, how do you balance something like open source against a career? How does that look? I think it's a tricky question to answer because, as people know, open source is essentially voluntary. Yes, there are some situations in which you will have donations, or there may be situations where there is a little bit of small amount of funding. But by and large, open source is staffed by volunteers. And I think people need to sort of be mindful of that. Because when you get into open source, it can be very easy to get sucked in and help out a lot. And then suddenly you realize, hang on, I need to make sure I'm still looking to improve. And so I think the phrase that is sometimes used is scratch the itch, whereby people will look to fix the problem that is affecting them, whether it's in their career or a problem they were unable to fix in their working life, or maybe something they were studying privately. And I think that concept is really important because balancing the career and your open source aspects is a really key point, because that nascent idea of wanting to improve your career, I think, does tie to open source. And, pardon the bluntness, but I think it's true with myself. I think I have improved a lot in my capabilities as a QA. And I think a lot of that, it does come down to open source, whether that's going to open source conferences, whether that's going to little hackathons, whether that's contributing to Selenium or contributing to Cucumber, now as a technical leadership team member. I think those skills that I've learned, whether it's open source coding, whether it's clear documentation, whether it's concise work on a tool such as Git or GitHub, that's made me a better QA. And in turn, that's then helped me to get that better role or that better job prospect in my career. So as a maintainer, what I would say with open source is view it as a learn and improve task. Look to open source and get involved with open source if you are so inclined to learn and improve, because that will help with the library or the framework, whether it's Selenium, Cucumber, or any library in any language you may use. Because if you improve those libraries, it improves, the community, but it will also improve you as an individual, and you will then be able to get that better role or look that little bit better on the CV, and that will help you grow as an individual and grow as an expert in your field. The last little bit I wanted to talk about is a bit more unique to me. That's not to say that other people don't have it. And it's the concept of multiple projects. So the title of this talk obviously hints at a variety of projects that I maintain. I would say that Selenium is something that I tend to contribute in flits and flops to. So in 2020, I contributed quite heavily to it. But in the last couple of years, I've only landed a couple of commits. Whereas something like Cucumber, where I'm on the technical leadership team for, I'm regularly contributing to and help rebuilding a lot of the Ruby framework in that. And then something like Site Prism that I've briefly mentioned is kind of almost feature complete now. So I'm just doing little new nuances as well as generic maintenance and bug fixes. Why is that important? I think that's important because tools fit together, and especially in, I'm not going to say all ecosystems, but most ecosystems, tools will have a symbiotic relationship. So Cucumber sits well with something like Selenium, which sits well with something like Capybara, and obviously Site Prism sits on top of that. So having all of these tools work together and work well together is good. And that's one of the reasons I gravitated towards supporting all of them. Although in Capybara, I don't actually contribute to that. Because these tools, they are important. And they all have an equal role to play in your testing framework and your testing effort. So for me, having knowledge on them all, an acute knowledge of them all, again, it improves that, as I said, the OSS versus career aspect. So it improves me in terms of career prospects. But it also means if something does go wrong, or if something is working well or not working as I expected, I know which part to hone in on. And I think as a maintainer, looking at these various tools, specifically how they fit together, is really important. But also looking at all of the projects as a whole is really important too. And so if you are able to, looking across multiple projects, even if it's only a little bit, is really important. When I was doing some of the refactor work to the old Selenium build tool, which was called Crazy Fun, which was neither crazy nor fun, but that's another story. I was working in Ruby for a build tool, but obviously for a polyglot framework. And so it was almost like multiple projects. It was Selenium in multiple projects. So even though you're working in one project, sometimes it affects multiple. When you're working in something like Cucumber, it frequently will work and affect multiple projects. Like I said, in something like the Gherkin library for Cucumber, it's written in over 10 languages, and I'm not going to attempt to name them all. So a change to the generic Gherkin grammar in Cucumber will affect over 10 different ecosystems. And those ecosystems could have multiple frameworks that all hook into. So it's almost like a combinatorial explosion where the growth of affecting one library can affect 20 or 100 libraries. For this next part of the talk, I'd like to do a little bit of a technical deep dive into SitePrism, as I mentioned at the start. So what I'm going to do here is hopefully do a live share of my screen and briefly speak about just the internals of SitePrism. I don't want to touch on everything, and I'm only going to spend a few minutes, but I just want to explain a little bit about how technically some of it works. There will be some code that I'll be showing through GitHub, but the idea behind this is I just want to show how the user would use this, and I'll again show an example at the end. So hopefully now when I go to share my screen, this should work. Okay, so SitePrism internals have a domain-specific language, or sometimes called the DSL. Now, the DSL for SitePrism uses a variety of methods. So we've got a nice module here called methods. And what the SitePrism DSL advocates is that you don't define, as I mentioned earlier, classes and methods, but you just simply write instructions. So here we have this method called element. So when you just write out the word element with a name and some locator arguments, it will do a lot of this complex work. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what this work is doing, but in essence, what's happening here is it's doing a lot. It's doing some checks, it's creating your element, but it's also creating some helper methods around it, and I'll show you that later on. There's a variety of other entry points. So we have elements here. Elements compared to element does a lot of the similar things, but what it will do here is it will return you an enumerable element. So the key thing here is you've got that iterable element. So this could be, for instance, there are many buttons on a page or many text boxes. There is also section and sections. These work in a similar way to element and elements. But the key thing here is that what we get here is we get a part of a page. Now this will actually return a new class. And then inside that class, we can further define element or elements, as well as further section or sections. So we can start to build a bit of a tree here. And again, with both of these, it will do some checks. It will create that section, but it will also create some helper methods. And again, I will show that in a second. There is also an iframe method for those of you who are working with slightly older websites where you need an iframe. This works again in a very similar way. It has a little bit of slightly different code, but the reason for this is purely because it's an iframe. Secondly, I'd like to look at the builder. So when we go away and we run these methods, we'll run this method called build. And this method build will essentially create our method. So it will use a technique called metaprogramming. And when we build this method, we want to make some checks to make sure that you've built a correct element. So you've not given me something that's blank, or you've not given me any way to locate the element. Then what we would do is we'll store the element you've built in this little dictionary, in this little hash. And then we'll add some helper methods. This little hash that we can see here, this is used in offshoot gens. So I think it's really important that we consider how other people might be using the framework. So when we store this dictionary of everything that has been created, We might then use that later on to generate new methods. I won't go into detail too much with that, but one such example is site prism all there, which I briefly touched on earlier, which will recurse through all of the pages. So what site prism all there will do is it will recurse through everything here and everything here. And if elements in here are section or sections, it will recurse through those as well. And then obviously it will check everything in element and elements. The next thing I'd like to look at is what's called the locators. Now, the locators I'm not going to spend too much time looking at, but the really important thing is that Capybara has a variety of ways of finding elements. What we're looking to do here is to look at our find arguments and remove anything that is a keyword. Now, the way in which Ruby will locate elements is you can have positional arguments and keyword arguments. Capybara leverages these keyword arguments in a really cool way. So what I want to do is simply build on that and use that. So in Capybara, you don't just need to locate an element using a locator, such as a CSS selector or an XPath selector, or maybe an ID. But you can also pass in strategies, such as I want the text to say certain things. I only want to locate an element if there are at least 3 of them. There are a variety of others that I won't go into details. Something that's quite new and more recent is when we start looking at things like shadow roots. So if we use shadow roots here, Site Prism will support that. Now, the beauty about shadow roots is this is something that came in with Capybara and Selenium. So all we have to do with Site Prism is permit it. We didn't need to build anything new other than just, if there's a shadow root, select it. We've got 2 locators here, one called find and one called all. They're basically the same thing, but one will return a single element and one will return an enumerable. And the key difference, as I mentioned earlier, is those enumerable elements used on the plural methods, such as sections or elements, will allow you to then enumerate through each of those buttons or sections on a page, and the single element will return that single element that you can then interact with, whether it's a button that you click, a text box that you type in text, and such. The next item to look at is the validator. Now, as I spoke about recently, Site Prism's been fairly stable for a while, so I thought one thing we could do is try and remove some of the bugs. And some of the bugs came about when people were creating elements or sections or iframes with weird names. You know, they might give a name that's just got a number in it, or they might give a name that's just called, you know, begins with no, so like, you know, no entry. The problem with that is that we will leverage the name for certain things. So I introduced a little tiny validator class that just basically threw some errors if you try to put in names that were going to cause problems. And the reason why names would cause problems, there was a variety of reasons, but fundamentally it was either a weird name or it was a protected name. And that protected name is really important. Because of the architecture of Site Prism, it leverages Capybara, which means that it uses the Capybara methods. Capybara is not a page object library, so you don't define these page object elements. However, Capybara does have a variety of methods that will interrogate a page, such as find me the current URL, find me the title of the page, the literal title of the page, find me, you know, the href or the full HTML of the page. And so if you were creating an element that had that name, it would conflict with the Capybara methods. So in essence, the validator was just a little bit of a guard to stop these problems occurring and stop them at the root cause when you build the page. Again, remembering that with Site Prism, we define instructions that then build your methods. I've talked a lot about the theory of how some of this technical architecture works, so I think it's best now to look at a literal example. So this is just a practice page for the Site Prism library that is used in some cucumber tests. And what we're doing here is we have a home page here, and we've defined this instruction here called set URL. So what we're doing here is we're saying when this home page is referenced, we know that the URL is going to be home.htm. You'll notice here that this is a relative URL, and so Capybara allows you to define a base URL. So this just, again, sits on top of it. This method here, set URL matcher, is used in a couple of assertion tests. So if you want to load a page and then check the page is loaded and no redirections have occurred, you can pass in some regex matches or some static matches. So again, this is a very straightforward way of asserting that the home page doesn't redirect you somewhere else. This URL match is also really useful because it allows you to load parameterized pages. So for instance, if you wanted to load, /user/32, you could pass in some regex here that validates that the end of the URL contains numbers. We've got some individual elements that we've defined here. And you'll see here that this first element, we have this little keyword here called XPath. So all we're doing here is we're saying that this locator strategy is XPath. Many years ago, when Capybara and Site Prism was first invented, we used XPath as the default strategy. Now, obviously, with modern webs, we use CSS selectors, which you'll notice in the items below. A couple of other things to reference are where we have elements. And again, this is an enumerable or a group of elements. We have individual sections, which are here. And you'll notice some of these we've defined inline. So we can actually add new elements inside it. So again, Site Prism is very manipulable in how you want to define something. We also have some groups here. So these are enumerable sections. And we have some iframes that you might want to define. Again, we can use an index for the iframe, as well as an XPath or even a CSS selector. One other thing that's really nice to note is these expected elements. So more often than not, when you load a page, you might want certain elements to appear. If you want certain elements to appear, you can specify that. So here we're saying we want the header and the welcome message to appear. Those other elements, if they appear or they don't appear, we're ambiguous to, we're ambivalent to. So this is leveraged in some of the assertion tests that are used inside the libraries, such as all there, and some of the internal libraries that are built into Site Prism, such as checking whether a page has loaded or not. This is a very, very, very quick and short technical deep dive, but what I've shown here is how you provide instructions to build your sections and elements. And so when you provide these instructions, such as here or here, it will generate 5 or 10 different methods that will help you define locators, but also things like Boolean tests, waiters. So it really does do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And all you need to do is simply write a line, which is the instruction for how that element should be created. I'm going to stop sharing now and pivot back to the studio. And so bringing this sort of talk, if you like, to a close, what I'd like to sort of not talk about, but sort of postulate or offer as thoughts is how I've seen evolution in the last 10 years, how I've seen some changes, and what might be the future, and a little bit of a go-away question for you all. So some of the misnomers or problems I had to deal with, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, were things like, oh, we need to make sure the testing language is the same as the programming language. Okay, why is that? Well, because we're running everything together. Well, as we've seen in today's modern sort of testing effort, we have containerization, we have Docker, we have things like Jenkins and GitHub Actions, which are now used in pretty much every company. Most companies will want CI/CD expertise. So actually, leveraging things in a common language has almost no relevance in today's testing stack. Now, people will then say, well, what about if you want to get expertise help? So for instance, from the developers. And I would say that is a very good reason to do so if you are going to get that reliable, repeatable effort. And I think, as I've noticed in my companies that I've worked in, is the developers will be focused on the development effort. So I think as testers, it's really important that we get, especially with automation, we get well versed in how some of these things work and be comfortable interacting with whether it's DevOps personnel or development people to get these various tools and architecture working well together. And then another item that sometimes people refer to is, well, what do I do to start with? And I will do one name check here that I sort of promised I wouldn't do earlier, but I really want to thank he goes by Tour de Dave Hefner for the Elemental Selenium, but also David Burns as the automated tester. And both of these people push heavily, especially for new people, on generate the thing that's easier. So again, David is a great proponent of this. If you're starting fresh, then make it easy for yourself. And so for me, going back all those years, I found it easy. Is there a need even today for things to be easy? I would say yes. So for me, using something like Selenium with Ruby makes so much sense because it is easy. It's very easy to write Ruby. It's very easy to understand Ruby. And when things go wrong, it's easy to triage. And I think if you think about what the day-to-day work that I do or a typical automation tester will do, is they will be doing these things. They will be running tests. They will be diagnosing why tests have failed, whether it's a locator is slow, whether it's the website has changed and something has broken. So all of these things sort of encompass together to give you that problem, that reason to do things in a language that's easy. So based on it all being easy, how do we then move forward to the future? What is the future going to be? It's a good question. Some of the trends that I've seen, especially in the last 5 years, have been componentization. I think that's a really important thing. So tools like Figma and from a JavaScript perspective, things like Storybook, these are becoming so popular. In 4 of my last 5 roles, people have been creating component libraries in Storybook, especially from a front-end JavaScript team. So being comfortable with these tools in terms of automation is really important. So how do you automate these tools? How do you test these tools? I think that's really important. Another thing that I want to sort of briefly name check is accessibility, sometimes referred to as ALI or A11Y. It's quite a new technology. So I think in terms of automating it, I almost take a bit of a standoffish view, and I actually don't like automating things with accessibility. I like to do it more manually because I think it's still quite new. I was learning about accessibility only 3-4 years ago. So for me, it's still something quite new, quite raw. And the proof in that analogy is when you look at some of the big organizations, whether it's in the UK or overseas, big governmental agencies. So in the UK, you've got gov.uk, and there'll be other agencies, I imagine, elsewhere. They are doing big efforts to get involved with things like open source and to get involved with things like accessibility and these tools that have been developed, whether it's the screen readers such as JAWS or NVDA, whether it's the accessibility tools. Some of the big ones available are things like Axe, Google Lighthouse, Wave. These all have various, users. And I think these tools really will help. But at the moment, my opinion is I like using these tools manually. I want to get better at them. So for me, that's another big thing to look out for. And then sort of bringing this full circle and to finish at the end, the last item I think will be really, really good to look at in the next few years is something called BIDI or bi-directional communication. So what do I mean by this? This is a tool that Selenium are taking the lead on. We're looking, especially in Selenium, to have ways in which people can automate more and more of the browser. So Selenium famously, 10, 15 years ago, was a web automation technology. So you could do basic web automation. More and more of the web is getting more complex. When we're testing now manually, you're needing to look at things like the network requests. You want to diagnose things using, API debugging. Chrome and Firefox, they're getting much more sophisticated. So having ways in which things can be intercepted, whether that's mocking or stubbing, whether you want to have a way in which you can turn off parts of the website, so you want to remove all the images from downloading. The BIDI or the bidirectional sort of wave, if you like, or the advent of bidirectional Selenium, I think is going to be really, really important. And for me, maybe not so much as someone who's not that involved with Selenium, but occasionally I contribute. I do take an interest in it. So I'm still heavily involved with reviewing some of the code that goes into bidirectional for Ruby specifically, although I take an interest in the other languages too for Selenium. And so for me, that's something as well I would look at. So yeah, as trends go, I would say definitely look into accessibility and bidirectional Selenium. But I think as well, the things that came out recently, whether that's more CI/CD and Docker, those are going to still be important, but I wouldn't say those are trends as such. I think those are sort of commonplace now. So yeah, I think that's sort of a nice sort of point to finish on. So from my perspective, I'd just like to say a big thank you again to Pallavi and obviously the previous, previous contributors on Selenium Live, because without those, we don't have this Selenium Live. And I know for one that I'll be keenly watching the next Selenium Live. But for now, I want to just sort of say thank you very much to everyone. Pallavi, I'm going to sort of hand back over to you now, if that's okay. I believe she said she's rejoining now. There we go. Sorry. I think you're on mute, Pallavi, at the moment. Yeah. Do you want to? Sorry, Pallavi. I've just literally finished now. So do you want to take over? And
Okay, so you can hear me, Luke, right?
Rejoining now. There we go. Sorry.
Okay. So would you like to just check if your StreamYard is not on mute? Because just
Yeah. I just
Yeah.
mute when you're talking, just so there's no feedback.
Right. I am okay. So I can hear you now.
Sorry, Pallavi. I've just literally finished now. So do you want to take over? And
Yeah, I would first like to. Okay, what is happening is right now is that if I mute, okay.
I'll stay on mute
My
while you
voice
talk.
is
Sorry.
echoing back. So what is right now happening is some concern with the setup. I'm very sorry about it, folks. I'm unable to hear Luke on StreamYard, but I'm able to hear Luke on LinkedIn. So let me just finish talking, Luke, and then I will settle it up. First of all, thank you very much for such an insightful talk. There were so many points I have noted, and there are so many phrases which you have said because of your such a vast and rich experience in all these libraries. In the world of open source in Selenium, Capybara, Cucumber, and Cyprism, that as a user of these libraries and as someone who has also started contributing back to open source, um, someone who has tried to provide solutions to people who are working on open source projects. One of the very good points which I found from your talk was you mentioning that it is not necessary that the language in which you are developing your test automation framework is same as rest of your team, because that is highly spoken about. Ruby is such a nice and easy language to pick up, especially for testers. That what you said really made a lot of sense. So thank you for that insight.
Yeah,
So
it's something
I'll
that
stop talking
To
now.
provide
Go ahead.
solutions to people who are working on open source
I'm gonna have to
projects.
hear myself back. Sorry.
That's fine.
Just
No,
let me
it's-
just say that.
Yeah.
And now, if it is okay with you, Luke, can you please read the questions here? Because if I do that, my voice will echo back. Sorry, I'm sorry about this. So we
That's
do
fine.
have a question from Ujjwal, and if you guys want to please start putting up questions, please feel free to do that. Luke, will that be okay with you?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I was just going to answer
Okay.
the first point that you mentioned about the language thing. I think it's really important to sort of double down on that, and the reason why is because of the interconnected nature of how things will run. So, especially when I was first starting, that was something that was quite spoken about. In the early 2010s, you need to be running the testing and your program in an identical thread because you'll get performance benefits, you will get speed benefits, and it will just be more optimal to have everyone looking at the same code. I think that's true, but it's only true in certain use cases, and especially not as much now in today's sort of technological age. And the reason why is because having the code inside the same repo is good, but does that happen in the use cases that happened in 2010, 2015? And I would say more often than not, no. The second reason is that in those day and ages, you would run things manually from servers. The way in which things were administered, you might use tools like Puppet or Ansible. I think with the more technical sort of infrastructure as service offerings now, things like Docker and Kubernetes, and whether you're using things like Red Hat, the way in which we are structuring our code now, whether you have a big polyglot library like Selenium, whether you have a very large mono repo that's very large, or you have microservices, more often than not, the testing sits outside, especially automation testing. So that's done because you want to be able to spin it up and run it ad hoc, which is important. And as such, you therefore don't get those benefits that were spoken about. So then the only real benefit comes from expertise. And as I alluded to in my talk, I do agree with that if you are going to have active developers who are code reviewing and suggesting, and they've got more experience than you maybe, that definitely makes sense. But I think what you'll find in business, depending on whether you're a multinational with millions of pounds of turnover or a small startup, is there is always a drive to get new features out, especially working in technology. And so you'll find that developer effort will be concentrated more on features. And so I would say I would double down on that. You need to be doing things you're comfortable with. So if you're comfortable working in Java, work in Java. If you're comfortable working in Python or Ruby, work in Python or Ruby. The reason that I sort of gravitated to Ruby was because it was the language that was written in the framework. But even in 2014, we weren't running them we weren't running them dependently. They were ran independently. We called one from another. So they could have been in different languages even then. And since then, everyone who I've met and worked with, the first thing that I'm always doing at any company is developing CI and CD systems, automated systems that can be ran independently of the website. And so I go back to the original point, which is if you are maintaining this, what is easier for you? What makes more sense for you? And what do you find easier to work with? And so for me, I've really enjoyed working with Ruby. I'll continue working with Ruby. I find it very easy to write tests in it. It's very easy and expressive, but also it's a scripting language. So it's designed to be ran quickly off the cuff as a little script. Yeah, hopefully that sort of gives a little point about that. You mentioned about looking at the questions. Just looking at the comment section, there's one from Ujwal. And Ujwal asks, how does someone start with contributing to code to an open source project like Selenium? It's a really good question because I had the same question in 2015, I think. So for me, there's basically three aspects. The first aspect is understanding the mechanism for contributing. So most, I can't say all, but let's say 99% plus, will use Git as a source control mechanism. So what do I mean by that? So Git will control the changes in code. And so you need to be familiar with how to use Git. A lot of open source projects will also have a repository. So you need to understand which repository they use. A lot of them use a piece of software called GitHub, which is a website. It's actually built in Ruby. Or they may use things like GitLab or Bitbucket. And these all leverage Git underneath, but they will be a website where you can view the code. So you need to be able to commit to that. So having a profile on those various websites is something that's important. And then the third thing really is the understanding the way in which that project will work. So with Selenium, it is quite a complex project because it's actually what's called a polyglot project. So Selenium is one project, but inside there's sort of like 5 projects, one for each of the major languages: Ruby, Java, JavaScript, Python, and C#. So contributing to Selenium, I would try and focus on one of the projects, such as one of the languages. And then it's simply making the changes, branching, and all of this strategy is something that would be in any Git tutorial. So learning how to do things like Git branching. Do your commit and push up. Now, with open source projects, they traditionally don't want you to push to their branch and to their website. So you'll need to do something called forking. And that's sort of the last step, if you like, is that you need to make a fork, which is like a copy of the project that you control. And then you make changes to your project and push the change to the overall Selenium project. And each project is different, but I can tell you from experience, Selenium has anywhere from 1 to 3 maintainers per language who will then look at that project. But the start process is the same. So it's understanding Git, understanding the source control repository. So that could be GitHub, Bitbucket, or GitLab. Looking at the code in isolation and making a change to your fork. And then also you will need to do a little bit of setup on GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket with regards to credentials. And again, that's just something that will be varying from website to website. But in essence, that's essentially how I would start. I appreciate that's maybe a bit more abstract, but I'm not sure at the level that you are at with regards to things like Git or committing and forking. I don't actually spot any more in here, Pallavi. I don't know if there's anything shared in like LinkedIn Live or anything. So I'll go on mute. I'm not sure if you're there. I was going to say, is there more stuff you'd like me to go through? Just because I can't see any more in the comments here.
Yeah, so what I have to do is I have to mute LinkedIn. And if I mute LinkedIn, I'm unable to hear you. And I'm here now. So even I don't see much questions right now being posted. I think what you just said and what you shared, it's pretty much clear to people. I've used Capybara with water, and it made life a lot easy. So thank you for being the person, one of the people behind this project, and obviously Selenium. And I will definitely go ahead and have a look at Site Prism, Luke. And thank you very much for your time today. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone who all joined this event. The recording will be there in our Selenium HQ YouTube channel. And any parting words, Luke? If you would like to
No,
share
so
something
thank you
recommending.
everyone for listening today. What I would just sort of part with, if you like, is what I posited at the end about the future of test automation. One other way that you can be involved with the future of test automation is to do test automation. So I'm a big open source fan. So just get involved a little bit more, even if it's just monitoring repositories or looking at how these various libraries work, because more often than not, a lot of these libraries that you're using, they'll be supported by a small amount of people. So wherever you can, throw in your 2 cents, try and offer a little bit of support, whether that's contributing to documentation, whether that's offering up new test cases or slight tweaks. I can promise you especially in all of my use cases, any support is always greatly appreciated. So from a maintainer's perspective, I would say, which is the purpose of this talk, is supporting maintainers can be done in a variety of ways, both past and present and future. There's so many different ways you can support maintainers, whether that's actively with documentation, whether that's actively creating new code or tests, or whether it's just writing a nice comment or something. So thank you all. But no, that's a good ending point, I think. I'm guessing you're still unmuting from LinkedIn or something. Sorry.
So, Luke, we have a question. Would you like to take that up? I think we will just take that one last question by what are some tech stack to look at in incorporating AI into test automation? Where do you foresee the future of test automation going?
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, so it's a good question. One of the maintainers of Selenium Ruby, Alex Rodionov, is they've developed a little bit of software that leverages Python. I would say stereotypically with Python, it's heavily involved in AI and language learning, large language models. So I think if you're looking at AI in test automation, the one I would recommend is obviously from Alex. It's called Alumnium, or if you're in America, Aluminum. And I think the key thing with a lot of the the LLMs that I'm seeing is they are a bit more cucumber heavy than maybe people think of them first, and they're very good at defining the test cases, but maybe not the underlying code. And I think that's one aspect. I think another aspect is, I don't know if you necessarily call it AI, but especially some of the work recently done by Selenium, maybe in the last year or two, to do with relative locators. Now, I've personally never used these, but I do appreciate the value they bring, where you are locating elements in a DOM relatively, so whether it's something that's near it or underneath it. The other major sort of tool, if you like, with regards to AI and automation, I think will be when you start looking at the AI that builds the simple single page app. I think will then look to absorb into that a full stack framework and almost go full circle. So where I said at the start, we've split, and actually you have an individual test library or an individual test framework that runs in a CI/CD pipeline. You've now got models, especially that will spin up very small single page applications, build me a video sharing website in 8 minutes and stuff. I think those libraries are going to look to start incorporating some tests into them. So you'll then go from build me a single, video sharing application to build me a single video sharing application with some unit tests. And then from there, I think feature tests and web tests naturally add on. So I don't view it more in terms of AI and automation. I view it as the full picture, if you like. And then just to sort of finish the question on looking at the future of test automation, I definitely think some of the LLM stuff that will generate the test cases is useful. But for me, I still think that you still need that person to do the architectural side of things. So that's things like getting the driver instantiation working, getting whether you're doing page object model, whether you're doing screenplay pattern. You need to have someone who's still going to set a lot of that up. I think the bit that I like the look of, though, is the stuff that's going to take more time. So generating a lot of test cases saves a lot of time. So for me, I think where I see test automation with AI is I think it won't speed things up, but it will remove a lot of the laborious tasks. And so what you'll find now is you will have parts of test automation that is fully AI and parts of test automation that's 0% AI. But I don't really see a part of test automation that's a mixture. So I think you'll get elements that are fully automated with AI, and you'll get elements that you still have to completely do yourself to generate an automation stack. But I think there'll be a very quick split where it will become fully AI or not AI. Obviously, the thing to bear in mind with AI is there still needs to be that human element reviewing. So I foresee a future where you'll write a command on something like GitHub. It will then generate 50 test cases in whether it's Cucumber or whatever framework you're using. You then review and merge those, and then those 50 test cases need fleshing out. So I don't think the actual underlying code will get automated, but I definitely see the test case automation through AI, and I would say more leaning towards Python being done soon rather than later.
That was a good point, Luke. It brought me back the one of the statements we say that 100% automation is not possible. So your point reflects that very well. That's very well said, Luke. Thank you so much again for such a wonderful session. I think it is one of the best episode. All of them have been great. And thank you, Luke. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone who joined in today. And we will see you next time in our next Selenium Community Live episode. Until then, take care, all of you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Cheers.
Luke.